So let's start. Hello, Professor Toshiro Yajima. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. So we are Marius. I am Marius HÉNAFF, and I am with Nicolau and Luiza to discuss your presentation. So today you introduced us to different attempts to modeling so a job guarantee in the US using two approaches. The first one was with an SFC model, and the other one with an IO one. Okay, and based on an MMT framework, which allows for such big investments. So quickly, if we recap in a nutshell the results that you gave. Switch slides. Okay. So you showed how to achieve a green transition to brown and green scenarios of job guarantee, and mainly we saw that there were trade-offs between output and emissions, and output and imports in overall, and that the sectoral allocation of resources mattered, and that today the current repartition of government spending is pretty good for output, but in terms of emission, there's better to do. So I think that's the most thing that we can say for now, and let's go straight to the discussion.
We wanted to start the discussion talking a little bit about the importance of politics to make feasible the economic ideas or whatever packages that we create to affect and make possible the energy transition. So first of all, since the author is clearly looking at the United States, we decided to bring a case study specifically showing how politics is complicated. The case study that we chose was the President Biden's plan for Build Back Better Act that was approved in 2021, but it wasn't the original version that was approved. It passed in the House, the Congress, with changes. So the core climate pillar, that was the Clean Electricity Performance Program, was taken out, and it was way less ambitious proposal than the ELR. So the goal was to create 80% clear electricity by 2030, basically reallocating the financiarization, but putting funds towards away from the fossil fuel industry. So we wanted to, as I said, the pillar was taken out, and we wanted to understand why was it taken out. This was the Senate that basically rejected the plan at first, and we might think like, oh, probably the Republicans rejected it, but the case was more complicated. At the moment, if you recall, the vice president was Kamala Harris, and the Democrats tried to use a very specific act that the US have. So basically, if they reached 50-50, basically a tie, the vice president could vote, so giving them a 51% since she is a Democrat. So they would be able to approve the package. And also the US has a special process called budget reconciliation. So in this case, they didn't need 60 votes, they just needed a simple majority. What happened was that we understand that they needed just 50 votes. Basically, all the Democratic delegates needed to vote in favor of this idea. But what happened was that one senator voted against. It was this senator of West Virginia, that is a state that is really tied with coal production. And he personally also had some involvement personal with coal business. So one vote made it basically killed this proposal. So what we wanted to bring is that there are power balances inside national politics. So we need to take into account lobbying powers and corporate resistance, also the civil society, labor union dynamics. Will this transition have wage guarantees? Will it be just? And also the institutional capacity of the US federal government to administer the target sectoral spending. One of the examples that we wanted to bring that is that in one of the scenarios that the author brings, he says that pouring 200 billion into IT services, basically computer programming, consulting for green jobs, this will probably favor the tech giants, basically Google, Amazon, Microsoft, instead of creating, intending public service ELR jobs. We also take into account the federalism. So as we saw in the previous case, in US there are 50 states with different priorities. California would be rather more favorable in approving such act than, for example, Texas that relies so much on petrol. Policy windows as well, as we saw that even in the best case, when you think everything will work out, things also can not work out. And on the imports, we wanted to mention some scenarios. Understand that the author understands the best scenario as the sixth one, so where he also puts that the imports will be reduced a little bit, but reducing imports is basically treated as a technical efficiency goal, but there also can be influences in WTO disputes that the US are part, and also could have some spillover into climate diplomacy. As we know, it's very based on cooperation. And we also don't know some countries that rely on importing goods from the US might retaliate as well.
So my point of discussion will be on the ecological aspects that you decide in your modeling. So your take is to take into account American territorial emissions, which is a point which is worth discussion because it's pretty standard, but it reflects only a partial view, because American output is integrated into global value chains, and there's a pretty wide literature that high-income countries reduce their carbon emissions by outsourcing them to other poorer countries, and so whatever reductions are decreased in the US, it might be like highly damaging for the rest of the world. And so there is quite a question about how this action takes a greater part into global effort toward any energy consumption reduction. Like, for example, in the IO cases that you use, so if I refer back to how you name them, you call like the scenario 4, which talked about six sectors, which are 6 green sectors. So they are listed here. There's mining support services, which is mainly like doing prospection for oil drilling in other countries. There's real estate and finance, and like IT, information service and telecommunications. So like pouring tons of money into AI, which has a huge material footprint and consumes a great amount of energy. And publishing overall, which gathers back with the rest. And so, yeah, you can skip. And so about yes, the global welfare concerns. So there's reducing American emissions is important, but the conventions that you use in international accounting are important, and and so it's taking into account the global material consumption that footprint that your output needs is a big point. So one of you can skip. One of the proposition that can be done is like a national ecological accounting, which measures material throughput of your economic activity, and which could allow accounting for the material accounting. for the material outsourcing. And now the last point that I would want to make is about the critical assumptions in your model, which is so about the emissions reductions and how it happens. So for example, in the SFC, you basically assume that you reduce your energy consumption by like in the scenario 6, by shifting your spending from the energy sector into your capital formation sector, and you assume that capital is a full green sector. And yet, well, as we saw before, we may like it is worth more discussion. And I think like these critical assumptions are really key points to discuss. And yeah, that's it for my part. I will leave it to Nicolau.
Well, thanks a lot. And having introduced these like hard politics to implement, and also these like ecological limits, let's talk about a very popular in this classroom discussion, which is of course degrowth. And with degrowth, and I don't know if you knew it, but MMT and degrowth like share a lot of common standpoints. First of all, like degrowth like talks about like the artificial scarcity of essential goods, which is one like greater expansion of MMT in some way, because like MMT through its application talks about like the artificial scarcity of money. And there is like a very nice paper that we will talk about afterwards, which is like Olk et al. That talks about like how we can finance like degrowth with MMT. It's also interesting to understand like the policy space for degrowth and MMT is the same, which is like global north, because let's not forget that MMT is possible if you are in the top of the currency hierarchies, and the ecological limits that you have already surpassed historically and you keep surpassing, it's probably you are in the same situation. For the case like of the United States, like anything that it's according to us, like anything that it's above like reduction, CO2 emissions and any kind of throughput in the economy, it's not enough to stop like climate change, which is like a very strong crisis that we're living. So, as a joke, like who is the GOAT? Olk et al. And Messi, of course, not Cristiano Ronaldo. It's degrowth. Degrowth always wins, and like it's very interesting in this paper to see like how like the job guarantee is tackled down, because for MMT, job guarantee is presented as a last resort program, which somehow it's still embedded in the capitalist system, right? I mean, MMT, what tries to adapt, it's like to make sure that everyone is unemployed within like the capitalist system. So it's still somehow constrained to the capitalist dynamics that are not always linked towards like a more ecological and meaningful way of like really ruling society. So when we talk, for example, of job guarantee within the growth, it's more on social provisioning, and they, like the authors, like Olk et al., also see them as a potential driver for a structural change. A structural change that it's needed, because, for example, when you talk of in the SFC model, you don't take into account like rebound effects, but rebound effects are like huge. They are very important in ecology, because like rising the output of 500 billions will have like an enormous ecological output within. So like how we can try to understand like this structural shift within the growth and MMT. Okay, so the answer that I've personally arrived, it's working time reduction. Working time reduction provides a set of measures that allows the whole labor market to introduce more people, and not in a way that just like people is not employed will do like X or Y employment, but in a way that we try to change the whole structure of the economy in a meaningful way. That's the most important thing, like, right? Because like it's not about like only what we do, but also like what we do and how we do it. And for the growth, and we work on this in a paper in Berlin with Sulev and Mena last year, that we were like tracking down like the working how like avoid like effects of working time, rebound effects of working time reduction. And we came along that like highly labor intense and low energy intense sectors, like for example, like public administration, health, education, and other kind of services are a very good sectors that from an ecological strategy, you should try always to increase like the people who is working there. Like in these scenarios, we don't care about like productivity, we don't care about other kind of economic aspects, as like the main objective is of course like trying to implement like low carbon policies. In this case, like for example, like other like primarily resources, extractivist, like that are very energy intense and low labor, you implement working time reduction in a way that you try to shrink those sectors in the meanwhile that you keep the capacity of production in a lower level in order just to have like a more sustainable transition towards a more meaningful economy shift. Well, and this leads us to like ask you some questions, as we will have to hear some feedback from you on what we have introduced here. So Luiza will start.
Okay, the first question would be, looking at the sectors that will lose jobs, what would be the effect if the training time and structure needed for workers to enter a new sector were taken into account?
Then the second question would be, with regard to the need for global ecological bifurcation, how would you include your job guarantee program into fair international climate policies?
And my personal question will be like, do you think that MMT could finance a more sustainable transition like the one proposed by the growth scholars? And if yes, can you propose like any further ideas that could allow us to have a better understanding on how like a more ecological transition can be led? Thanks a lot, and very interesting presentation from your side. Thanks.
Thanks, Giuliano. We will give you the floor for, we leave the questions, the presentation. Yeah, you can go and see it. And so you have the floor. Do you want us to keep the questions, or can we stop sharing?
I save it in my screen, so it's
fine. So you can
yeah,
stop the sharing,
okay.
so that we can see.
Maybe I can maybe if I may, I would like to also to put my slide again, because
okay, perfect. So it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll share it again. There you go.
Okay.
Okay. So first of all, many thanks for the discussion and then the interesting point raised by by discussion. I'm again really honored that you spent so much time go to some of this contribution that I wrote again some time ago, and then maybe some of the point that you raised obviously had to do mainly with some of the discussion that arose after in the aftermath of the pandemic, and the discussion of especially the policy one related to the political economy aspect of the IRA. And again, those set of contribution again were developed more or less at the same time, but then again, maybe they not have to withstand very well the passage of time. So again, taking as a sort of a preliminary sort of caveat in terms of what I'm gonna say to address you some of your comments. Generally speaking, I mean, especially from the policy side, so from the political economy side, obviously this plays a role, and in general, this is sort of this is something actually that at the Levy, some of my colleagues have those explicitly working on this the sort of the MMT track, let's say, or using using MMT to inform their analysis are widely recognized. So the importance of the political economy sort of factors. And so, and it's in a way you can sort of find this idea of, taking problem into account this when also in some of the writing of Minsky in terms of, especially when you compare, the idea of mechanic mechanic sort of Keynesian. So mechanic is not exactly the word, but I mean the idea of having this the mechanic approach to Keynesian sort of demand management versus a more sort of well, one can use it sort of the political economy idea to sort of understand correctly, different influence that those aspects play in a specific time. So coming more specifically to some of your the point that the question that were raised. So looking at the sectors, the losing sector, let's say. So again, this is in a way is. So this is a way was one of the point that I also raised in the sort of the SFC model, though I didn't spend time in working on that. And then I kind of offered me a way to reconnect with one of the points raised by by one of the discussants. I guess it's the Argentinian one because he threw the joke on Messi on the joke on Messi. So I mean, I think it must be from Argentina, let's say, or have some relatives there, let's say. So I mean, in a way, the original sort of the idea of the job guarantee is really the idea of a buffer stock that expand and shrinks depending on the idea of depending on how the business cycle sort of performs, and more particularly the spending decision of the private sector. So in a way, the original idea cannot be really sort of well, it's hard to complement. So let's put it like this: it's hard to sort of use the very core idea or the basic idea as a way to sort of change the sort of the structural condition of your economy, and in particular the one of the labor market. If one takes this very sort of neutral sort of aspect in terms of this department will shrink and increase depending on just the business cycle behavior of the economy. So we just absorb any excess of labor supply, and then we'll throw it again when this shrinking cycle is over, let's say. So we just effectively we just do it's akin to a welfare measure, let's say. So it's actually a substitute for a welfare measure. Though obviously, I guess the training part. I mean, one can sort of counter this argument or complement this argument. Say it is true, but to a certain extent, maybe the training part it's the one that can sort of act as a sort of the lever for at least retaining or repurposing some of the workforce, and as a way to sort of introduce a way to sort of improve also improve the structure of the economy, certainly the structure also of the labor force. Though again, there are some issues that the geography itself cannot cannot address alone. So in this sense, and then again, it was part of the contribution, especially again the scenario 6.1 is. And again, I have to tell myself is I'm really a fan of sort of policy mix. So whatever is so again, the redistribution sort of scenario was really a way to sort of introduce some kind of structural change effect in the economy, and and the idea of kind of to sort of leveraging, the two sort of set of this policy, one can sort of also add something to sort of complement this program. So obviously, obviously again, the training effect maybe, I mean, if one relies on a kind of a business cycle approach to hiring and firing those people who are being trained, obviously can be a sort of a limitation, because, if all of a sudden you say there is a turnaround in the business cycle, and the cycle, then a training that for this training will be over, and then I mean, it's this worker won't be able to absorb sort of the new technology, the new skills that are required, to understand the new set of the new reality of the labor market. So, in this sense, one can maybe, sort of focus on, so, and then that's why, actually, if you look at some of the contribution that that we will find in this platform that has been developed by some of my colleagues, you will see that most of the new contribution, especially the policy one, has been addressing more, the underutilization of the labor force. So, simply put, the long-term unemployed. Say the one that they're not like being fired let's say in 3 months, or they are subject to this fluctuation in sort of the the business cycle, but they are more that are affected, that I mean they cannot really find the sort of a job in the sort of the formal sector. So in a way, these are sort of the pool that, especially it's also from a policy perspective, have attracted policymakers and and scholars in sort of identifying this project as a way to sort of introduce some elements of obviously welfare, but also job creation and skilling upgrade. So in this sense, obviously, those won't be sort of, this won't be affected by this hiring and firing mechanism related to the business side. So again, it is different from a sort of a core Minsky mechanism. It's certainly different from a departure from the contribution made by Minsky on this subject. But it's a way, but it's also a way to sort of address some of the criticism, I mean, of this simply sort of was understood as simply sort of very sort of mechanic mechanic sort of approach. And so yeah, and again, this is a sort of way to sort of address some of the issues raised by the discussant, or could be, let's say. So as for the ecological bifurcation,
Giuliano, maybe if you can maybe take 2 more minutes, but then so that we can leave some space for the discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. How would you include the? So yeah, obviously there is a relevant rule for sort of debating in sort of taking into sort of a more multilateral approach, let's say. It is obviously again one there is also the usual argument that sort of one sort of one policy adopted by one single country won't even if this the country at this at the center of the global trade and financial system won't save all the other countries. So there is spaces for thinking on a more critical level about the importance of multilateralism. Though these days, as you may know, it is kind of this all the multilateral system is in a kind of jeopardy due to this basically to the new the set of policy adopted by the current administration, let's say. Or approach, let's say, let's put it, in a polite way. So, I mean, obviously there is space to discuss this. And yeah, I mean, this, obviously this is, this contribution by, Haeckel's co-authors. I mean, and obviously, I kind of follow their sort of broader sort of approach, and then also some of the criticism of, of this, say that this, the finance sort of mechanism. And further ideas, well, I mean, that's, obviously some regulation at the financial side has to be sort of addressed. And again, this is something that has been recognized also in this sort of broader MMT literature, importance of capital controls and all these kind of things. And which again is sort of departure from, previous contribution that, were pointing out towards a different direction, let's say. But yeah, obviously, financial regulation does play an important role in this. I mean, at least in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
Thank
sorry
you.
for taking up, and then yeah.
Maybe you can stop sharing your screen so that we will see a little bigger screen. Yes.
So I ended up not using it.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, thank you for the nice input. My name is Luis. I'm from Germany. I have a question somewhat technical. As you mentioned, for the long run, the Godley Cribs fiscus get dance. I would be interested if you also thought about the trade performance ratio, and for especially also for the long run, as we are in an open economy in your model, and about the endogeneity of the propensity to import.
I had exactly the same question, so great.
Hi, I'm Jonas from Switzerland. I was wondering, throughout your whole lecture, it very much reminded me of the Eurogreen, what a similar task has been undertaken by the Eurogreen model by Alessandro and Dahl. And I was wondering, because when I went through your paper, you didn't seem to cite it, but at the same time, I felt like some of the shortcomings that you were presenting in your presentations were kind of solved there. Like, for example, differentiation in different skilled workers, but where their shortcomings is that they only have one type of job guarantee that they implemented. And yeah, I was wondering if you ever thought of, taking up that model and then kind of implementing those different scenarios there, or have you compared it to their outcomes, whether the outcomes are different, because their model is also calibrated, as far as I know, for France and not for the US. But yeah.
Okay, maybe you can answer first those two questions, and we will take few additional ones later.
Okay, I agree with the, obviously, the trade performance ratio does play a role, and then obviously you can interpret the fact that, in any case, you have sort of a slight improvement in terms of output in scenario 6, but still, it's not really that much, because you still have sort of a lower, higher than the baseline sort of import demand in this scenario. Because again, I didn't improve the import propensity, let's say. So, obviously, this is the endogeneity, the endogenization of the import propensity, or the sort of the elasticity, or the Tyrrell ratio, however you're gonna put it in a more sort of dynamic way. There are colleagues that have been done this, working on this topic. To be fairly honest with you, I'm not really. I've never really followed these approaches in, let's say, in endogenizing in a model. Let's say I would rather prefer it in introducing as a scenario. Let's say in a scenario in which there is, some ways in which I either introduce some reduction because, the effect of a policy in the technology. I act in the they act in the technological parameters, and I act in, let's say, in this ratio, or the turbo ratio, or the elasticity, or the the input propensity, and this will come down, rather than having modeling in a more having as a result of the modeling, the model simulation, that is being a mechanism, let's say endogenized. So this ratio is a function of something else. So there are colleagues who have been working on that, and then maybe I can point out towards a number of this contribution. But they're not, they're not really sort of. I guess this is also part of from my understanding, Tirwall itself wasn't really, I won't say happy, but satisfied with some of the results of this endogenization, because in a way, he kind of interpreted a sort of the critical parameters, and then sort of introducing a fact, let's say it's a function of something else in the economy, that is some level of government expenditure, that this will introduce an additional feedback, and then this complicate the story even further. That being said, I mean, I totally agree with you that this is not a sort of a exogenous or given or a natural sort of parameter in a kind of a neoclassical sense. I do also recognize that there is some work to be done to at least to sort of interpret the behavior of this technical parameter, or you can extend it also in an input-output framework, and understand how to correctly model sort of an impulse substitution sort of effect, say, and not just introduce it as a sort of exogenous shock in the simulation. So yeah, this sort of address your comment. And on the Alessandro, and actually this gives me a hint to sort of to talk the Alessandro model, which I understand that there are. I know colleagues who have worked with us in the team of D'Alessandro who have done some simulation comparing, for instance, different set of policy, labor policies such as working time reduction, employment guarantee, minimum wages, so on and so forth. And I'm not sure if this work has been published yet. I've seen this work presented in a number of conferences, but I think, obviously this one is more obviously calibrated and has a more sort of, it's a more complex and sort of detailed model with respect to the one that I presented today. And I'm also interested in, the mechanism, the structural change mechanism is interesting. I mean, at least how they, how they model it. Though it is interesting because they kind of retain the property of modeling, of not fully endogenizing, let's say, the technical coefficients and the import coefficient parameter, but they still can this have sort of behavioral or to be more precise, evolutionary sort of approach, in which sort of the technology changes, but there is some bound change in direction, bounding the direction of the technical the technical coefficients. So in a way it's similar to sort of a Leontief approach, or a mixed sort of Leontief approach, in which there is the possibility to swift technology, but let's say, well, it's akin also to a Sraffian sort of story, in which sort of you have some bound, some spaces, but it's not like a completely smooth neoclassical production function, like in a CGE model, in which you kind of assume this sort of says function that adjusted as a function of the price, of relative prices, let's say, which is something that I personally don't like and I don't want to introduce in my simulation. And it's one of the fear that I can, that drives me when I introduce. So, for instance, to return on the elasticity question. So there are authors in Brazil who have made this process of changing the import elasticity ratios as a function of I've did it myself actually, as a function of the real exchange rate. But again, this may be problematic for the point that I was raising with with respect to the other question. That is, you introduce some feedback which is with the function of of prices, and then mix the outcome of the model could be very could deliver you some results that are at best questionable, let's say.
Okay, thank you. Is there a remaining question? Yes.
Hello, I'm Hannah from Austria, and I know that I have a question which is not really connected to the modeling part, but somehow maybe it isn't. And I'm interested in what you would say would be some pillars which has to be given in any sort, wherever you want to implement the real job guarantee. Because what I saw so far is whenever a job guarantee was implemented, it was mostly as pilot projects with a lot long years of preparing it and people who were working on it. And for example, in Austria, we just had this recent phase, and they built the model, and there was so much work putting in beforehand, then it was running for a short period of time. Then it is a lot of work afterwards to recalculate what was going good, what was not. But I would say the actual goal, and also going a bit back to the presentations from my colleagues, is that it should really be implemented as something fixed and stable. And so far we saw that it always depending on also the fiscal feasibilities with changing politicians. Nobody's really allowing to go further. But so my question is, somehow how could we simplify the whole process from modeling? And you now looked at the case for the US, but I feel like how can we realize that a job guarantee is more becoming a universal proposal? What has to be given? Because one last point, I think one of the strengths of job guarantee is that it takes into account the local whatever is there, and you can really react on that. But so what are the major points in your vision?
Okay, floor is yours for this last question.
Okay, I'll answer very briefly by recommending a paper that has been written last year by Rani Antonopoulos, and you can find it in the website of the one of the job guarantees. It's a working paper of the European Trade Union Institution organization, so the Research Institute actually, so the Research Institute for Trade Union based in Brussels, and well, actually, I'm gonna spoil this. Gonna work on, sort of a cost estimate on, with the ETUI and with Gania, in which. But this paper can address part of your question, because it's really kind of identify some of those previous experiences, previous challenges that previous experience of implementation of this program has faced over the years, mostly, related to the idea of, the political cycle, let's say, and, the limitation that some of those policies had. So, for instance, they were limited towards youth unemployment, focus on underemployment or rural unemployment, let's say. So, that didn't have this kind of universal sort of hiatus that, obviously, it was present in the, it's present in the original sort of theoretical contribution. So, this maybe has more, you can get way more insight than, myself by, going through this paper. But in general, I agree. I mean, there is an issue here in terms of identifying, again, it is not useful, in my opinion, to sell this sort of policy as a sort of a one-size-fits-all sort of policy, because it is not. At least in my opinion, this has to be sort of that goes hand in hand with a broader sort of policy package to address, several challenges that can arise from here and then. And again, it's very very case specific, it's very country specific. So, I mean, it's in some cases, and again, it's not, and another thing then this basically is useful to address is the fact that, this has not to be, sort of a substitute, or doesn't have to represent a substitute for general other welfare sort of policies.
Thank you very much, Giuliano.